Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a video form of a blog post which I wrote in April 2021, which as part of that year's blogging from A to Z April. It's going to be a historical overview and general summary of the Divine Comedy. It's not going to be an exhaustive like synopsis and review and such of the entire poem. That's subjects for another day and way too exhaustive to get into here, and it's just, basically the general publication history and Dante's writing process and things like that. So do look forward. I will be doing more in-depth treatments of the different three canticles of the poem in future, as well as other things I have previously discussed. You can find it in my All About Dante and the Divine Comedy playlist, and I'm wearing my medieval costume gown again because why not, in a topic about the Middle Ages, and I just love medieval costumes. If I ever find a husband, I will be wearing a medieval Renaissance style wedding gown in a very distinctive color like purple or dark blue or even black. I'm not wearing a white wedding dress. So let's just get into it. Dante began work on his magnum opus somewhere between 1304 and 1308, inspired by an idea he'd had for many years, immortalizing his unrequited love Beatrice for all time in a long, epic poem. Since the original manuscript isn't known to survive, unfortunately, although in future there may be some wonderful discoveries, and Dante didn't record his exact writing dates, and we don't obviously know either from secondhand sources, such as letters he was sending to people that have been known to survive either. All we have to go upon are hypotheses. Dante finished it in 1320 or 1321. The oldest known manuscripts date from 1330, hand-copied in full by the great Giovanni Boccaccio. He didn't copy them from the original, but from other copies, and that's how all books were in that day before the days of the printing press. You were just illuminating manuscripts or writing everything, by hand, and these fools, young whippersnappers, making fun of writing by hand, even print, not even, cursive. Oh, why would you want to know how to, read writing or learn how to write? Yeah, because some people believe in writing things by hand, and you can't print and type everything, believe it or not. After Dante's death in 1321, the final section couldn't be located, or at least according to legend. I'm not sure how true to actual history this is, but I do like the story. And there were no notes left behind with instructions for finding it. His former patron and still very good friend, Congrande della Scala, was asking for, I believe, the last 13 cantos, so basically from 21 to 33 of Paradiso, and he hadn't received them yet, and nobody else had, and he was just, wanting to know where they were. And Dante's two oldest surviving sons, Jacopo and Pietro, he's also had another son, Giovanni, but it's believed he had passed away by that time, and they, couldn't find it anywhere, and they were just finally thinking, oh, let's just, finish it ourselves in the style our dad was using and send it off to Congrande. And, they were writers themselves. They mostly did commentaries on Dante's work and other things like, for example, astronomy and theology and stuff, but they weren't really so much poets themselves. So, if they had actually tried to do that and hadn't found, the actual concluding cantos their father wrote, who knows how different the poem would have been, and if it would still have quite the exact reputation it does today. And also, according to this legend, which was I believe first in Boccaccio's biography of Dante, which is a lot of people regarded as a lot of tall tales and kind of a fanboy just fawning over his fave rave and not necessarily grounded completely in history. And so Dante appeared to his son Jacopo in a dream, an early morning dream, which were believed to be especially prophetic, showing him where the end of the manuscript was kept. He appeared to Jacopo, and Jacopo asked him Padre, are you alive? And Dante was like, yes, I'm alive in the eternal life. And he took Jacopo by the hand, led him upstairs, and he banged on a section of the wall and said, this is where you can find it. And the next day, Jacopo found it in that exact location. There was kind of a space behind the wall, a hollow wooden panel, and he pulled out the ending of the poem. It was kind of getting a little musty, so it was obviously not, thank God, faded at all. So he and Pietro just copied it out by hand, so the ink would be a lot stronger before it God forbid vanished and they couldn't see all of the words to copy it from. And they sent it to Congrande della Scala, and from there it went off to the entire Italy and all of Europe, and now, thank God, eventually the entire world knows about this beautiful poem. And even if that story that didn't really happen, I really like it. It's a, sweet story, and sometimes, dreams do come true. They're like prophecies of things that happen, or we, looking for something we lost, or just an answer to a solution, and it just comes to us in a dream. The original title was simply Commedia, and Dante does refer to it as his comedy at least once during the poem. So, that's obviously wasn't a title people called it afterwards. That's what, he himself identified it as. About 40 years later, Boccaccio first appended the adjective divine to the title. I will be inserting a picture of the first version that officially called it the Divine Comedy. It's from 1555, and it was owned by Galileo. It's a very early printed edition. Many contemporary people are confused by the title, since it's not what we recognize as a comedy in modern times. But historically, a comedy was a genre with a difficult start for the protagonist and a happy ending, written in everyday language, so obviously the opposite of a tragedy. The first printed edition was published in Foligno on the 11th of April, 1472. 14 of the 300 copies are known to survive. The printing press is in Foligno's 15th century Oratorio dell'Annunziatella, which is kind of like a chapel, like, a small building attached to a church or standing on its own, but that's like a subject for a whole other thing. There are all sorts of, different church buildings, and not all of them have always necessarily been like completely for religious purposes. Some of them also had, printing presses, and particularly in the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance before the printing press, many of them were also, bookbinders and working on illuminated manuscripts. They did a lot more than just, what many people today would associate with, a church or oratory chapel or whatever. Venice printed the next edition in 1477, followed by Florence, Fiorenza, which as it was called in those days, in 1481. The book is divided into 3 canticles, or the word for canticle in Italian is cantica, and the plural is cantiche, C-H-E and C-A. The C-A is singular, and C-H-E is the plural form of the word. Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Each, except for the Inferno, contains 33 cantos, and Inferno contains 34, but many people feel like the first canto of Inferno is more like an introduction to the entire poem and not necessarily part of Inferno proper, even though it is, because each one has 33, and that, all adds up. And in addition, many people also consider the first 2 cantos of each canticle like prologues, even though obviously they're, altogether part of each canticle. And it's also, obviously, this is more like complicated to get into here, but you can also read the poem vertically. So, for example, like Canto 1 of Inferno corresponds to things and themes in Canto 1 of Purgatorio and Paradiso. And my the Durling-Martinez translation of Purgatorio, in almost every note section, it ends with something called intercantica. So it shows how you can like read and relate that canto to the corresponding cantos in Inferno, and if the price ever drops significantly on their translation of Paradiso, hopefully they will also have that intercantica section there, so they can relate each canto and each canticle together, and so how you can completely read the poem vertically. And obviously there are many things you can figure out from other sources and on your own too. It's not a book you only rely on one source for studying. And so there's a total of 100 cantos throughout the entire poem. That's a lovely rounded number, and Dante also loved the number 9 and the number 3. They were just, his lucky numbers. They appear like so often throughout his work. Dante wrote in terza rima, 3-line stanzas, terzets, or terzina, or terzine in Italian, with the rhyming pattern A-B-A, B-C-B, C-D-C, which I have discussed in length in a blog post and a video form I did of that blog post. This was a poetic form he created, possibly influenced by the Provençal troubadours he so admired. Because Italian is such a poetic language, it's easy to find natural rhymes for so many lines. It's much more difficult in English, causing some translators to employ forced rhyme schemes, and has generally seems to have been fallen by the wayside in terms of translations. Most translators these days, they're, more like Dante scholars, are into medieval history and Italian language and literature and classics. They're not just, poets who happen to have studied like Italian and are interested in Dante and some Italian literature, they're actually bringing everything to the table, and they're also doing it like in blank prose and iambic pentameter, or just, generally not forcing it into a rhyme scheme just because it's a poem, because, rhyme schemes don't always carry over like perfectly from one language to another, but I have discussed this in much greater depth in previous videos I've done. Each canticle ends with the sweet, hopeful word stars, stelle. So this is going to be like a general overview of the poem, now shifting away from the general historical overview, and I might at the end get into a little bit about how I came up with an idea for Dante to still write his magnum opus in my alternative history if he was able to actually marry his dream girl, even though he still like goes into exile and most everything else is the same in the poem. 35-year-old Dante wakes up in the wood of Error on very, very, very late Maundy Thursday. Some people falsely call it Good Friday because it's, so late in the day, but it actually is technically Maundy Thursday. In the year 1300, no idea how he got there or lost the way so badly. Taking courage by the rising sun, Dante starts climbing the delectable mountain and presently inquires a leopard, signifying lust, a lion, signifying pride, and a female wolf, historically called a she-wolf, symbolizing avarice. And he seems to be the most terrified at all by this wolf. No, he's not like quite as terrified by the lion or the leopard, which seems to be kind of, reversed for most people. Most people would be most terrified of all by a lion and not necessarily so much by a wolf because they're, so closely related to dogs and they, can be tame if it's the right kind of wolf or like treated properly. Dante turns back fearfully and comes face to face with another terrifying being. Dante is ecstatic when the shadowy form identifies himself as Virgil, author of the Aeneid and Dante's idol. Like he's like so blown away. He's like this like effusive speech to Virgil. Are you then that Virgil whose tongue pours forth such a broad river of speech and light? I took my own sweet style from yours. I just love you so much and admire you. I'm so happy you're here. Save me from this beast who makes my veins and pulses tremble, famous sage. Virgil says he was summoned by Dante's lost love Beatrice, who's desperate to save him before it's too late. Virgil guides him through hell and purgatory, providing support, encouragement, an emotional, just fortitude, step up there and be a man and face your fears, or if you're too afraid, I'll, help you. I'll cover your eyes when these people are threatening to turn you into stone or when there's something really scary. And he also sometimes, lectures Dante when he's, not acting properly and, it's, tough love kind of, not like yelling at him or chiding him to be mean, just telling him to, shape up, or we've got to keep going, or this isn't something you should be listening to, vulgar talk like this, and also offers protection when Dante is afraid or overcome by emotions. Dante encounters many famous people during his journey down through the 9 circles of hell, some of whom he personally knew. Each circle holds a different type of sinner, and the lowest circles contain multiple rings. And as I've discussed previously, this is almost in many ways sort of like a continuation of his discontinued encyclopedia Il Convivio, the banquet, which he intended as, a banquet, as the title indicates, of all existing human knowledge at that point, which is why there's, so much history and geography and astronomy, mathematics and theology and all sorts of things throughout the poem. It's not just, an epic poem which happens to star himself in his religious conversion and, getting back on the right track with his life. It's also intended as just, celebrating human knowledge and a wonderful guidebook. It's more than just, another poem, which is one of the many reasons we're still reading it today and why you can't just, read it on your own. You need lots of study sources, and I am planning a future video based on a blog post about extra-textual sources for studying the Divine Comedy, but I would like to put a number of more sources like YouTube channels and books and websites and such on that list before I make the video form, because I want as many resources as possible to share. Dante and Virgil then reach the shores of Purgatory, which is guarded by Cato. The lower slopes of the mountain of Purgatory comprise ante purgatory, for souls who need to do extra penance before gaining admission, and some of these people repented literally at the final second of their lives, were very, very late in repentance. But unlike the people in hell, everyone in purgatory takes responsibility for their sins. They didn't die unrepentant or blaming other people or like claiming they did nothing wrong, so they're holding themselves accountable. That's the difference between the Inferno and Purgatorio. They're like, they both sinned, and many times they committed the exact same sins, but it's just the difference of the motivations and the attitudes, and owning up to it and trying to make atonement for what they did in Purgatorio versus in Inferno. They're just I would do it, like, I would totally do this again. I don't see why I did anything wrong. I don't care if I'm in hell. I'm proud of what I did. And so Purgatory proper has 7 terraces. As they leave the 5th terrace, they encounter Roman poet Statist, Dante's second favorite writer, and who was widely regarded as the greatest Latin poet of the Roman literature Silver Age, although unfortunately he's not really known much anymore. And if he hadn't been in the Divine Comedy, it's kind of like people might not even know who he was nowadays, because his reputation just hasn't like remained as like high as, for example, Virgil or Ovid or like Horace or Lucan, just other poets of the classic Roman literature world. And so Statist, Dante at least attributes to him, there's not really any historical evidence for this, that he secretly converted to Christianity in the 1st century of Christianity. And so that's why he wants, Statist to be saved and include him into the poet. And Statist accompanies the rest of the way, all the way until the very end of Purgatory, although we don't see him again after they ascend into Paradiso. So probably Dante had a reason for that. He didn't, just deliberately like leave him out and forget him after that. Statist ranks 4th of the poem's recurring characters, after Dante, Virgil, and Beatrice. Finally, on Easter Sunday, Dante reaches the earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden, on the summit of Mount Purgatory, and meets Matilda, or Matilda as it's actually written in the text. There's an E instead of an I, who prepares him for his reunion with his beloved Beatrice. Dante begins crying when he realizes Virgil is gone, and Beatrice rebukes him for his perceived sins of, forgetting her and chasing after like false idols and being interested in other women, and just, drowning himself in like secular things and only like doing philosophy for its own sake instead of, being more serious about religion and using his God-given talents for like good instead of, just like wasting them away. He should be like writing more poetry and using this poetry to, glorify God and write about good things to help the human condition, instead of being like more hedonistic and into himself and not as religious, and serious and spiritual as he could be. And she, tells him to pull himself together. Like, she basically says that, and actually this is the first and only time in the entire poem when Dante is addressed by name, and she says, like, Dante, though Virgil leaves you, don't cry yet, for by another sword you must weep. So she's basically saying, don't cry yet, boy, I'm about to give you something to really cry about. And yeah, as I said, for the first and only time in the poem, Dante is addressed by name, and it's mentioned in the notes in the Durling-Martinez translation. It was kind of seen, as a, like, being, like, I guess, like, excessively, prideful, or, like, calling attention to yourself. Poets and writers in those days didn't really like to include their own names in their own works in it, unless it was, really distinctive, or there was an exact purpose for that, because you don't want to, like, use your own name too much. It's also considered prideful. And I'm also trying to do this in my alternative history. Obviously, you can't, like, not use a main character's name, like, ever, but, obviously you're trying to be mindful of the medieval attitude and carry that in, so, like, basically people aren't constantly, calling one another by their first names all the time, because that's just, kind of how things were, and you have to, like, respect and work with that style a little bit instead of being all like a modern thing. On Bright Monday, the day after Easter, Beatrice escorts him to paradise, composed of 9 concentric celestial spheres around Earth. And I did do a previous video on Empyrean and the medieval conceptions of the heavens in the last 4 cantos of the poem. Paradise is topped by the Empyrean, home to the most important saints and biblical figures. Mary is on the top step, and as you might remember from the Canto 2 of Inferno, Mary is the one who ultimately sets this journey in motion, and I believe Dante possibly may have, felt a special, like, relationship to her, because he lost his blood mother. He did get a stepmother later, but he lost his, like, real mother when he was only 4 or 5 years old, 5 or 6 years old, sorry, and many people who have lost their mothers, particularly at a young age, they just feel a special connection to Mary, and Dante probably might have been among those people as well. Dante is able to see the light of God, and with it the perfect union of all realities, and the understanding of everything in this world and the next. In the center of this light are three circles representing the Trinity. But, being a mere mortal, Dante can only see so much with his eyes. It's like his imagination can only carry him so far, like, his wings cannot, like, ascend to that height to write about this, intense spiritual thing he's seeing in this experience he's having, and he feels like his, like, poetry is suddenly like the weakest thing in the world. It's weaker even than a baby wetting its tongue at its mother's breast. His soul, however, perceives the harmony of the universe, and he understands love as the mechanism behind God, the universe, life, and everything else in existence. And so, like, for many years, one of the, like, probably the main reason I was hesitant to, like, start writing this alternative history I wanted to write where Dante marries Beatrice is because, like, look, if he gets to marry his dream girl, after all, even if they're not, immediately married, they do still marry their respective real first spouses, and they're both widowed in their early 20s, and their, like, marriage is arranged by Beatrice's father, Folco, who doesn't suspect, as, like, everybody else knows, even if, like, they don't think they know, that they've been, like, really in love since they were children. And Ser Folco, like, decides that this would be a perfect remarriage for you guys. You both lost your first spouses really young, and you unfortunately lost your first, children before birth as well, like, when you've been, like, dear friends since childhood, and he loves and trusts Dante as, like, as much as one of his own sons. And so, like, why not just, get married? This would be a great marriage. And they, do get married, and they have eventually 4 children together, and, like, the exile still happens, but, Beatrice and their only son, their youngest child, Brunetto, who is named after Brunetto Latini, one of Dante's mentors and father figures. They're, taken hostage by their enemies, the Black Guelphs, while Dante is, getting his 3 older daughters and his much younger half-sister, Gaetana, who's also pregnant and newly violently widowed, into a flight-ready carriage to, escape the city. And then he, gets the same notes, like, come stand trial for these false crimes, and your wife and son are going to die, and oh, by the way, your wife is also with child, and wouldn't be a pity if you lost all of them. And, he's, does what he does in real life, try to get back into the city with some of his friends and overthrow the Black Guelphs, but none of that works out. And then he gets, notice saying, your wife and your son are dead, and then just, throws him into depression. And then he eventually begins writing in this book Beatrice had given him before they were separated and the exile began. It has a cover with beautiful marbled paper from his favorite apothecary in those days. Apothecaries sold, books and medicines and spices and candies and stuff, not just, what we associate them with today, just like the traditional, like, medicinal, like, medieval stuff. And so he begins, like, writing this epic poem, imagining Beatrice reaching out from beyond the grave to save him after he's been suicidal and contemplating suicide. And then will there not, be an eventual, like, real life reunion, and not just one in paradise. And, because his oldest daughter, Gabriella, whom he named after his mother, keeps telling him, look, our enemies might be lying to us. Maybe they really are still alive, and you'll have a wonderful reunion. And it doesn't really change anything much about the poem, but, that is a reason for him to want to write this, even if he does, like, really marry this dream woman of his, and they do, live happily ever after for a time, and there may or may not be a future reunion with that. So it was just something I really had to think about, because it would kind of have been like a boring story if they automatically marry by the time they're like 18, 20 years old, have kids, they just go into exile together. Like, what's, like, the drama or the tension in that? Or why would he need to write this poem if he's together with his wife all these years? But thank you very much for listening. Please consider liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing. I'm hoping to get to 100 subscribers by the end of this year, and that will be more possible when I get more engagement and trigger the algorithm more. My next video I'm planning for Monday, Valentine's Day, as I mentioned, that will be my 11th Duran anniversary, and I will be talking about how I fell in love with Duran Duran when I was in my early 30s. That was a huge surprise to me, because, like, all my other favorite bands are classic rock and pop, who were around, like, a lot longer than my own lifetime. And this is a band who actually, well, they technically formed a year before I was born, but they were, got famous in my actual lifetime, and they're still around now. So that's, like, totally different than usual. So look forward to my fandom story if you're interested in that. And I possibly be doing another Dantean post later next week if you're only interested in my, like serious, like Dantean or like booktube and authortube related content. So thank you very much again for listening, and I will see you guys again very soon. Thanks. Bye.